Hello everyone, and welcome back to Translationborne, the show that's all about translation, Bloodborne, and the translation of Bloodborne, beginning this time with a look at another chalice description. All-encompassing holy chalice of cursed desecration. One of the all-encompassing holy chalices that breaks the seals in various places in the underground ruins. That which is cursed is a possibility for a special ritual method, but the transformation is typically a lethal thing, and is not a thing to be performed lightly. Furthermore, Pthumeru is the name of an ancient race that built the underground ruins. They are said to have been an inhuman people who possessed knowledge holy and mysterious. But thanks to our review of the chalice formula in the last episode, most of this text will be no mystery to us. The opening line is the standard one on all root chalices that indicates they can break multiple labyrinth seals, and the information in the closing section is a repeat of what we've seen on almost every other Pthumeru chalice so far. That just leaves the title and the central part of the description to consider, both of which are interesting for different reasons. The title I find noteworthy mostly by contrast with the name of its fixed dungeon equivalent. If you've seen my detailed look at the differences between the two English language versions of the game, you may recall that the name of the non-root version of this cursed and defiled chalice differs based on region. The North American release calls it simply the Defiled Chalice, which lines up with the Japanese, while the British English version of the game calls it the Cursed and Defiled Chalice. When it comes to the root chalice, though, both English language releases use the lengthy name Cursed and Defiled Root Chalice. That's for good reason, since it matches the Japanese, which clearly deploys both the descriptive terms for being cursed and blasphemous or defiled. So whatever issue affected the translation of the defiled chalice across the two English versions had no impact on the root chalice for the region. I'm not entirely sure what to make of this, but I do think it's important to bear in mind when considering the chalice names in sequence, since it makes whatever happened in the fixed version of the defiled chalice stand out. One change I'm more sure of the reasoning for, though, and one implemented without any inconsistency, can be found in the unique part of the description I mentioned earlier. In researching this text, I discovered that in version 1.00 of both English language releases, this section was the same as on other root chalices, noting how they change the dungeon's form each time. Well, that got me curious about the wording of the Japanese in version 1.00, so I fired up my physical copy and verified that it too used to comply with the typical template. That makes this an instance where we know the developers felt it was important to add information, and both English versions of the game were updated accordingly. Furthermore, if we consider why this was done, I think we can see how that newer translation accomplishes the same goals as the Japanese edit. Essentially, I see two purposes behind adding these lines. First, they differentiate this chalice from the others in the sequence, and second, they inform us that we now have access to the additional right, curse, but performing it can be dangerous. Really, both this root chalice and the defiled chalice that it's associated with function as a sort of tutorial on this mechanic. First, when we acquire the regular defiled chalice, we learn that we need Bastards of Loran, a special material, to access it. Then we discover in going through the defiled chalice that the curse effect cuts our HP in half. Thus, when we finally claim the root chalice, it lets us know that we can now perform this additional rite at will. That's appropriate, since if we're following the typical route through the chalice dungeons, this root chalice is also the first one we have the option of modifying with the cursed rite at all. And if we experiment with it, we'll see that the rite also requires Bastards of Loran to perform. In this tutorializing context, players should well understand that the utterly drastic change to the labyrinth can be lethal, and the mere existence of the English lines makes this chalice stand out just like in Japanese. Not that there aren't still more impressive chalices, like this next one. Great Chalice of Pthumeru Ihyll, one of the holy chalices that breaks the seal of the underground ruins. Great chalices, in particular, are things which connect to hidden portions of the ruins. As for Pthumeru Ihyll, it signifies the Pthumerian monarch and royal capital. That is likely proof that the descendants of the Pthumerian civilization worshipping the sleep of higher rank ones at least tried to establish a monarch of their own. So there is a lot going on here. This is probably the single most important chalice description in the game, but before we get too far into analyzing the specifics, I want to emphasize that, like the text on the other important chalices we've looked at, a good part of its significance comes from the ways it does and does not conform to the template text I've spent so long discussing. For instance, consider how the naming convention perfectly matches what we saw on the Great Ihyll Chalice. This is true even down to the dropping of the word great from the two related root chalices, and so provides evidence by way of repetition that it was a deliberate choice to make great chalices exclusively ones that lead to preset dungeons. Speaking of which, note how we not only see a repeat of the standard opening line common to all story chalices about breaking a single labyrinth seal, but also the same definition of great chalices afterwards. All of this serves to reinforce our conceptions about great chalices, and may even help build up anticipation in players. After all, the Great Ihyll Chalice culminates in an encounter with Ebrietas, the Great One who we know is at least connected to the origins of the choir. It therefore stands to reason that players might expect a similarly significant sort of encounter or discovery to be made in this other Great Chalice. But repetition isn't the only reason this description feels so important. If anything, the ways it breaks the mold prove even more striking. After seeing chalice after chalice defined at least in part by its depth, not just in Pthumeru but in Loran and the Hintertombs as well, the sudden designation of this chalice as Pthumeru Ihyll is noticeable. Furthermore, up to this point there have been only a handful of repeated lines telling us anything about Pthumeru or the Pthumerians, the most prominent of which appears on nearly every other Pthumeru chalice. Here, though, we're suddenly presented with completely new information. Taken together, these deviations from the norm make this seem like an entirely new region, even as it remains grounded in Pthumerian civilization. Add to that the reinforcement of the idea that this is a great chalice, as well as the knowledge that it's tied to the deepest depths of Pthumeru, and the end result is an inherent sense that this chalice is of great significance. It's a powerful example of the storytelling potential that can come from the careful consideration of repetitive and formulaic text, a revelation players have been working towards without realizing it as they collected item after item. Yet obviously, not all of the storytelling on display here is structural. All that new information is important not just for being novel, but for telling us more about Pthumerian culture. It also features what I believe are some astute translation choices, and I want to examine these in more detail, beginning with what might look like a puzzling shift in the final set of lines. You probably noticed that the official English version presents a narrative of humble ancestors and proud descendants, while my more literal version comes off more neutral. That's because this is one of those cases where the strictly literal fails to capture the full nuance of the Japanese grammar. To demonstrate this, let's focus on the phrase semete karera no o o itadakou to shita. Here we have the verb itadaku, which in this instance probably refers to the idea of establishing a leader, if the use of this particular kanji in this particular context is any guide. Anyway, the verb has been conjugated in the o to suru form, which grammatically expresses the idea of attempting something while often implying that said attempt came to nothing. This verb phrase is preceded by a direct object marker indicating that the previous set of words, karera no o, is the recipient of this action. Karera is a third-person plural, no in this case indicates possession, and o means king or monarch. The subject is identified in another part of the sentence as the descendants of Pthumerian civilization. So if we put all this together, we get the idea that these younger Pthumerians tried to crown a monarch for themselves, with the implication that it may not have gone well. So far, so neutral. But now we get the use of the term semete at the start. This is an adverb that expresses a speaker's minimal level of satisfaction while also signaling that they are aware of it being less than ideal. It usually gets translated at least, such as in the sentence, "Please come and see me at least once while you are in Japan." The implication is that while the speaker would like to see the listener more than once, they realize that's unlikely and are willing to settle for less, but believe a minimum of one visit should be involved. That might seem obvious, but consider what happens if we apply this logic to the Pthumerian descendants raising a leader. Here, the grammatical implication seems to be that while the members of the generation in question realized they couldn't reach the level of the slumbering Great Ones, they believed they should at least be able to elevate their own leader, so they attempted to do so with what may have been bad results. In other words, the later Pthumerians, in particular, felt entitled to name themselves a leader, just like the official translation tells us. That the translators saw these grammatical implications at work and then brought them out in the English text strikes me as deft work. What's more, the one point that you might argue got lost, which is the grammatical sense that the Pthumerians' attempt at raising a leader didn't work out, may well have been intentionally de-emphasized because of the game's lore. To see this though, we're going to have to take a look at a new bit of information from a couple of new items, the Pthumeru Ihyll Root Chalice and Sinister Root Chalice. Rather than repeat any of the text we've seen before, the non-template portions of these descriptions read, "The Pthumerian monarch is traditionally a woman, and is said to have inherited an old name generation after generation." So apparently there were several generations of Pthumerian queens, meaning the Japanese grammatical implication that the Pthumerians tried but failed to name themselves a leader doesn't apply. At least not in the ordinary sense. It's still possible that what's actually meant to be conveyed is that the attempt to raise a leader failed in the long run. But then there's no need to confuse the issue by stating in English that the Pthumerians' effort to name a queen failed. For my part, I think the context of the Chalice Dungeon sequence itself works well enough with the text in both languages to form the basic outline of a story for what happened. Since we know that the deeper into the Chalice Dungeons we go, the older the region we're traversing, that means the portion of the labyrinth associated with the period immediately following the Pthumerian monarchy's heyday is the one that's cursed. Furthermore, we know that curses are a sign of the Great One's wrath having been incurred, often in cases involving tragedies befalling children. Taken together with the text we've read on the chalices so far, this suggests the tale of a civilization's rise and fall. In the early days of Pthumerian civilization, its people deified the sleep of the Great Ones. Over time, the descendants of those people believed they should at least have a ruler of their own, and so tried crowning themselves a queen. This led to a line of queens who seemed to have ruled for generations, until at one point the wrath of the Great Ones was invoked. Subsequently, Pthumerian society declined, until all knowledge of their civilization was lost except for rumors that they were a superhuman people possessed of arcane knowledge. Admittedly, I've done some interpretation here, but if we accept this as the broad outline of what we're meant to understand after working our way through the underground ruins and coming across the information on the Ihyll Chalices, then I think the English text works just as well to suggest this story as the Japanese. It maybe leans a little more into the implications of the chalice sequence to compensate for some missing grammatical nuance, but it gets there in the end. Nor is this the only instance of tricky connotations in the Japanese version of the Great Pthumeru Ihyll Chalice, which I believe the translators succeeded in conveying thanks to their knowledge of wider context. There's also a specific word in the original that I believe was deliberately chosen to play with people's expectations. That would be the term ol, which can technically refer to a ruler of any sort, but which is usually associated with kings. I think the intention was for players to read through the information on the Great Pthumeru Ihyll Chalice and assume that the chief royal figure mentioned there would be male. That would then make the reveal that the Pthumerians' leader was traditionally a woman more striking, because it would challenge those pre-existing assumptions. I actually debated making my literal translations use the word king to reflect this, but since to the best of my knowledge the Japanese term isn't quite as strongly gendered as the English word king, I decided against it. Instead, I made the same move as the official translators, and went with the gender-neutral term monarch. This has the advantage of addressing two issues at once. First, it doesn't come off sounding self-contradictory or strange. And second, it has the potential to invite the same sort of assumptions from first-time players. Really, I can't think of a better way to preserve the opportunity for a reveal in the Root Chalice descriptions, even if the word monarch doesn't go quite as far towards throwing players off as the Japanese. Thankfully though, not every instance of new information presented in the Japanese is quite so challenging to render in English. In fact, there's at least one idea at play that has the advantage of perfectly fitting into the cultural context of many English-speaking players. Consider the one part of the Great Pthumeru Ihyll Chalice description I have yet to discuss, the statement that Pthumeru Ihyll could refer either to the royal capital or to the monarch. This actually ties in beautifully with the concept straight out of English linguistic history. In fact, the first thing I thought of when I read this line back in the day was how noble characters in Shakespeare's plays would frequently refer to themselves and those around them simply by the name of their country or the land they ruled. For instance, fairly early on in Act 1, Scene 2 of Hamlet, King Claudius has the lines, "Thus much the business is, we have here writ to Norway, uncle of young Fortinbras." obviously referring to the King of Norway and not the literal country, since a country can't be anyone's uncle. Later in that same scene, Queen Gertrude proceeds to say, "Good Hamlet, cast thy knighted colour off, and let thine eye look like a friend on Denmark," which we're also supposed to understand is a reference to the King of Denmark, Hamlet's uncle, and not the country. Nor is this anything unique to that particular play. King Lear, for instance, actually has a cast of characters identified in the stage directions by names like Cornwall, France, Kent, and Gloucester. So when Bloodborne mentions the Pthumerian Queen being referred to by the name of the region she's associated with, it resonates with English language traditions. I actually wonder what this phrase calls to mind for Japanese-speaking players. Do they think of the ancient Yamato clan, known for their rise during a period associated with elaborate tombs from a region of the same name? Do they think about how that name can be used synonymously with Japan to this day? Or are they more put in mind of European traditions? Either way, I imagine the result is similar for players around the world, which is that it makes them think of ancient linguistic practices associated with monarchies. In other words, we're once again seeing the translation achieve the same effect as the Japanese, albeit this time thanks in large part to broader cultural context. But of course, things don't always line up so neatly, and we don't have to look any further for an example of a more complicated case than the final part of that Root Chalice text. Here we encounter what at first glance seems like a simple idea, which is that each generation of Pthumerian monarch inherited an old name. When you stop to think about it though, it's surprisingly hard to pin down specifically what that means. For instance, is the old name that's inherited the same one in every generation, meaning each successive Pthumerian monarch is called the same thing? Or might there be a number of different traditional names, perhaps associated with different branches of the Pthumerian royal family, which the monarch might inherit? For that matter, here's another question I didn't even consider until Last Protagonist suggested it to me. Did the queens take up an older first and last name, or just one or the other? Based on typical usage, the Japanese might suggest that the full name and the first name are more likely candidates than the last name, but there's no way to be sure of the exact meaning. Now, we do have a little more information to go on here, I just haven't quite gotten to, because I think it's clear that the name of the final boss of the preset Chalice dungeons is meant to tie in with the information we get on the Ihyll Chalices, as well as various other aspects of the game. That much is obvious both from the name and appearance of that boss, who I'm about to encounter right now. As it turns out, she's one of the Pthumerian monarchs we've been discussing, and her name literally translates to something like Yharnam, Queen of Pthumeru. I'll have more to say about her name and her role in the game and its lore later in this video, but in the context of this discussion about inherited names, it's worth pointing out that we don't know for sure whether Yharnam is her first or last name. In the face of all this uncertainty then, what are we to make of the idea that the Pthumerian queens inherited either the same ancient name or one of many? Well, for my part, I'm inclined to turn to the thematic implications of this information. Ultimately, I see this as a practice that puts an emphasis on continuity with the past. It highlights the importance of both lineage and legacy, with each successive generation carrying forward the values of the last. So when I consider the official translation that these monarchs assume a name with classical roots, I'm inclined to think it carries the most important features of the Japanese into the English, even if the wording might seem like a deviation. After all, it's essentially telling us that the ancient queens took on names associated with an even more distant past, which gets at the core of the original. This even works with the practical considerations we can tie to the present day. Obviously, the name of the Pthumerian monarch being Yharnam implies the modern city of the same name is related to this line of queens, and thus the ancient Pthumerians. It also trades on the same sort of logic connecting a ruler to the region they ruled that we saw with the title Pthumeru Ihyll, effectively making that line a form of foreshadowing. Again, I believe the key point is that if we're going to take Yharnam as the name that was passed down among the ancient queens, then it's also important to acknowledge that for these queens, that name was already old. It's another example of the extent to which even the Pthumerian leaders revered their past, while also suggesting that for as long as anyone can remember, there has always been a Yharnam, and the roots of the current city of that name go back further than we can trace. That's something the official translation referencing classical roots ties in with perfectly. Having said all of that though, there is one aspect of the Japanese that I don't think comes across as strongly in the official translation. That would be the sense of generational inheritance. For me, the use of the Japanese terms daidai and tsugu in the original speak to the idea that this was a practice each queen took up in succession. and this is something that also has a good amount of thematic relevance to Bloodborne. There are obvious connections to this that we can see in the importance of children to great ones, among others, as well as what seems to be a generational divide between the two main church factions. But then there are also parallels when it comes to hunters. Just think about all of the things that we inherit. We grow stronger by taking in the will of the dead that lingers in blood. We can tease the art of quickening from the bones of an old hunter. We can peer into Lawrence's memory by touching his skull, and glean knowledge about the true state of the world from the skulls of deceased madmen. In a sense, you could say that we inherit much of what makes us powerful from the dead, often through the means of a biological medium. Meanwhile, the Queens of Pthumeru would have inherited what power they had through biological means as well, and in taking up ancient names and titles, they'd have perpetuated both those concepts and their significance into a new generation. Now, as is often the case, you can still get these themes from the English language version of the game, but they're arguably just a little more prominent in the Japanese. This isn't to say the official translation is bad. As I was just mentioning, I think there's a lot you can say in its favor. I simply want to acknowledge that I feel like there's an element of the original that doesn't come across as strongly in English, despite my appreciation for the official wording. But that's probably more than enough on the chalices that brought us here. What about the actual boss I'm fighting? Well, of all the things we might say about her, one thing we don't need to spend too much time on is the translation of her name and title. Literally, the latter is listed first, consisting of the katakana for Pthumeru, followed by the particle no, which in this case means of, and finally the word queen, this time in its more typical rendering using the kanji for woman, followed by the one for king or monarch that I mentioned earlier. Her name then consists of the familiar katakana for Yharnam, which is how I got my literal version, Yharnam, Queen of Pthumeru. Straightforward as this is compared to the official presentation of Yharnam Pthumerian Queen though, I will say that I think the official translation remains the better option. That's because not only do I find that using the term Pthumerian in the title makes it sound more epic, but also because it subtly accomplishes two other things at once. First, I would argue that it makes people a little more likely to view her as one in a line of many Queens of Pthumeru than they would if she were identified simply as Queen of Pthumeru. Second, it has the effect of blurring the line between civilization and people. We know from reading many chalice descriptions that Pthumerian is the term for those of a certain lineage. At the same time though, it's also the most sensible adjectival form for describing something that is of Pthumeru. Since Yharnam here is clearly both of the Pthumerian line and the ruler of the civilization known as Pthumeru, this blending of the two senses of Pthumerian works exceptionally well to describe her. So I think the official translators nailed this boss name. Of course, the most important aspects of both this character and her name have little to do with how they stand on their own. Instead, they all come down to how learning about Queen Yharnam recontextualizes other pieces of the game's lore. We've already seen this when considering some implications of how her name might tie in with information we can find on the chalices, but there's an even bigger, more direct connection this character has to Bloodborne's story that we need to talk about. You see, we've encountered some form of this character before. After defeating Rom in the Moonside Lake, the only way to advance the story is to approach the figure of this woman. Then we get a short scene of the Red Moon closing in, lose consciousness, and reawaken outside Yahar'gul with an injunction to seek the Nightmare Newborn. Given that this boss version of Queen Yharnam is visibly pregnant, and we can even hear a baby's cries if we approach her, it seems as if somehow her child is the one associated with the Mensis ritual. So this isn't just some queen from Pthumerian history with a name that combines with the chalice lore to give us interesting background on the city of Yharnam. She and her child are instrumental to the night of the hunt we're currently caught up in. But the reveals don't stop there either. There's another way learning about this particular boss name could reshape our interpretation of events so far, and it also happens to be one where a lot could hinge on the translation. Only it's not the translation of this boss name that matters, it's the one for the Shadows of Yharnam. I don't know about you, but that particular boss name stuck out to me the first time I played the game. Why should the Shadows of Yharnam only appear at the end of the Forbidden Woods, far outside the city and close to the entrance of Byrgenwerth? Well, now that we know there's also a character named Yharnam, and that it's the name of the woman we meet in the Moonside Lake at Byrgenwerth, suddenly there's another way we might interpret this old boss name. What if we were to think of these snake-like figures as the shadows of Queen Yharnam? That is, something like her royal guard that always go where she goes. Suddenly, this puzzle of a boss name might make a lot of sense. But this is where we need to return to the question of translation. That reimagining of the boss name might work as a double meaning for the English word shadow, but does it also apply to the Japanese term kage? Well, as far as I can tell, yes. I mentioned back in episode 37 of Translationborne that the Shadow of Yharnam boss names were a pretty straightforward case of translation, and I stand by that even with this context in mind. This appears to be one of those fortuitous cases where the Japanese and English meanings behind a term line up extremely well. Specifically, there's a sense for the word in my Daijisen Japanese dictionary that says it can refer to remaining close to a person or thing and never leaving. So whatever you make of that theory, it seems to work in both languages. Thankfully, that's also something you can say about the final connection between this boss and the rest of Bloodborne's lore I want to mention. However, to do so, I'm going to have to jump the gun a bit and bring up the text of the description for the trophy you get upon winning this fight. There, Yharnam is identified not simply as Pthumerian Queen, but the Blood Queen of the Old Labyrinth. This uses the exact same phrasing for Blood Queen, Chi no Joou, that we've seen both in Japanese and in English for Annalise, Blood Queen of Cainhurst. So even as I've emerged victorious over this boss, it remains an open question whether she's as immortal as her modern counterpart. But then, is Annalise really Yharnam's modern counterpart? And what does it mean to be a Queen of Blood? Should we be trying to learn more from the implied parallels between these characters? The reuse of that one phrase leads to all sorts of major questions, many of which have no solid answers, but which are fun to consider nonetheless. Before I leave you to that, though, I want to conclude by saying that I am a huge fan of how the translators handled the whole reveal surrounding Queen Yharnam. It's one of those moments in the game that makes you feel like you've really gained insight into the hidden truths of Bloodborne's world, and I am so glad they managed to recreate that in English. But now I'm curious to hear what you think. How did you feel about this moment of revelation? Do you have any thoughts about this episode you'd like to share? Remember, your feedback is always appreciated. Alternatively, if you want to hear my thoughts on any of the other subjects I've covered so far, check out the Translationborne Index linked below, which should be up to date within 24 hours. Until next time then, thanks for watching everyone.